a great honor and pleasure to be back here to speak to you guys. And so today I'm going to talk something about, I hope you guys see this, okay. So this topic on a special political narrative, so what we call dare to struggle. Usually we find in the Chinese governments and the communist parties, the speeches and the documents these few years, especially under President Xi Jinping's rule, increasingly we actually hear terms like that. So so I'm actually going to examine this term and to look at the sources. Okay, usually, well, I'm actually talking about the intellectual sources of the creation of such a term and how it is related to our understanding and also some misunderstandings about the term. Okay, so this is actually what I'm going to talk about today. So basically, just begin with some basic information about my study, okay, and the use of the term. And then I also talk something about the recent debates in the Western scholarship, okay? So what scholars have been debating about this term, and then explaining something from China's perspective, okay, the official perspective on using such a term nowadays, okay, under President Xi's governance. And that's the first part. And the second part will actually be to my project, this will actually be the main dish, actually, but I'm actually still developing it because this is obviously not just the study of politics, but also, history and philosophy, those things. I'm going to try to see if there is any connection between nowadays use of the term called dare to struggle with what we had before, okay? And for some of these things, the intellectual origins, 1, 2, 3, I guess you guys you may already have an answer, right? All right, say, for example, there could be highly possibly there is a link between Xi Jinping's idea, the use of struggle, the idea of struggle, being connected to Mao Zedong's thought. Okay, that's actually pretty much obvious. But for others, maybe we need some more examples, okay, the evidences to prove that. So why do we need to study this term? When we look at a lot of the scholars nowadays, studying this term, they're actually using it to describe China's foreign policy. Okay, so it's like kind of the attitude China has towards the outside world, especially towards the West. So it has to do with the rise of China as a leader and probably as a challenger to the current international order. This is one aspect, and on the other hand, the scholars are also talking about the problems that China has to face nowadays in its domestic politics as well. So it has to do with the legitimacy issue. So the struggle, the need to struggle with, for example, the United States outside, and as well as the need to struggle inside within the country. Say, for example, with the deteriorating economy nowadays. Or corruption, okay, such as these things. So there are always two dimensions there. So, the external one and the internal one, the domestic one. And I think perhaps this term is actually one of the most misunderstood Chinese political terms today. Because it would be easily being used by commentators or scholars, to describe China as of course, not just a rising power, but also being aggressive and being unfriendly towards other countries. So, I guess to some people outside China, it's actually very easy to have a feeling that, well, China is so far away and so alien and different from us. And so for this study here, part of its goal is to alleviate the mysterious feeling and fear among the foreign readers and to clarify some of the stereotypes and misunderstanding among the foreign audiences and to decode the myth of an aggressive, angry, reactive, and belligerent China. Okay, so these terms, I guess, nowadays we actually heard quite frequently. Sometimes I actually receive some information, about a conference on China, or the new books or journal articles talking about China. Really, I mean, this is actually what I can observe. These adjectives describing China. So I would like to clarify that, well, perhaps this is actually not the whole story. Okay, there are always some other ways to look at China. And hopefully I can actually reinforce the meaning of what we call dare to struggle there. Okay. And to struggle, of course, this is an English translation from the Chinese term. Okay, we call it 敢于斗争. Okay, so this is actually if you look at the last 3 points here, so these are actually the original Chinese characters there. Okay, I guess most of the Western scholars, they've got it right to describe that this is the CPC, the Communist Party of China's core spirit. It is something related to the legitimacy, okay, the political legitimacy of the party states. I think this is correct. And but on top of that, I think we have something more to understand it because it has is historical significance as well. When you look at the whole modern Chinese history, and my argument would be, well, if it is not the CPC, then such a spirit, dare to struggle, would actually be a spirit being lived out by maybe some other parties or some other political forces, or like it's actually within the nation. Okay, the spirit is actually not just something belongs to the Communist Party, but it's actually something you can also find in traditional Chinese culture as well. So it's actually within the Chinese intellectual heritage. Okay, so this is actually why I think the term here is important. And how do we understand this term? Well, this is something about methodology. I'm actually not here to present to you guys an empirical study, of course, because as we know, Chinese politics is always a black box. And I'm not actually here to tell you, well, what's the Chinese leaders they are thinking about. I have no way to know. Okay, so I'm not actually explaining the so-called most authentic or official intention or definition about this term. Instead, I'm actually focusing on the ideational and ideological aspects, okay, to try to recover a more comprehensive intellectual history of the evolution of the idea, okay, bigger than, okay, it's actually from the CPC's use of the term, but then it's bigger than that, okay, it's actually bigger than that. So from there, we can actually have some more innovative and new perspectives to look at the idea. So dare to struggle, it can be a slogan, okay, it can be an idea, a conception, a discourse, okay, different scholars, they actually have different terms to describe it. I would say, or yes, okay, all these different terms are actually appropriate to be used to describe such a term called dare to struggle. But my focus here would be really on narrative, because narrative is actually about a story. And this term is actually not just telling us something about, well, is an idea to be propagandized or promoted, okay, or it would actually lead to some sort of political action, something like that. But it's related to a whole story in modern Chinese history. And it's only from a broader, okay, a more general understanding of the term, historical understanding, then we will actually have a more comprehensive understanding of the use of the term. As I have said, the term dare to struggle, this is in English, of course, so it's an English translation. How accurate it is actually very much debated. Okay, so I've actually just done a little bit of search there and find out that, well, in the English-speaking world, actually this term was used in some other context, totally unrelated to China. And And we actually have more examples actually in the US, like the American writers and scholars, they actually use terms like daring to struggle, okay, to describe the labor rights movement. So they have to be, related to sort of left-wing, okay, left-wing political ideology. I'm not sure if I actually can use the word socialist in the American context, but it's related to the labor rights. Okay, so you actually have books, say for example, titled "Daring to Struggle, Daring to Win," written by Helen Schiller, and she's actually talking about uh, the not just labor justice but also racial justice in Chicago. So so we actually have examples like that. So so China actually doesn't really have the monopoly of using a term okay, for this one. And this is actually just a translated term. But if you look at the Chinese term, okay, that in Chinese called 敢于斗争, of course, this is very Chinese, of course. This is actually the original term. So it actually comprises with two parts. So the first two characters, 敢于, that means dare to, and the later two characters, 斗争, actually means fight or struggle there. Okay. So and some would actually translate that. I mean, 斗争 translate that into campaign or battle or strike for something. Okay, so in translation, of course, we have more different words to describe the original one. But in the academia, there is actually already a debate on the use of these two different versions. Okay, so dare to fight and dare to struggle. I would actually agree with Professor Todd Hall and also Professor Hu Xiaoyu. So one's actually from Oxford and the other one from the US, the University of Nevada. Both are actually very experienced Chinese politics experts. I would rather agree with them that, well, dare to struggle probably would be a more appropriate term to be used. It's not just related to the original meaning, the original meaning of the English word fight and struggle, but it has to do with how people have already used these two terms. And when you look at the some of the Western media's writings, you see that usually in newspaper, okay, the newspaper writings, you see the use of dare to fight is very commonly used. And the use of such a term usually would be related to, the depiction of China as a more aggressive, and threatening country there. And so some examples. Now, this is actually not even a newspaper, Foreign Affairs, very famous, journal. And you actually see that, well, from the first paragraph already, you actually see that, well, they are mentioning about President Xi Jinping's speech. Also, he's talking about dare to fight. And then immediately you actually have the response from the writers, okay, saying that, well, the president is actually preparing the country for war. So, and then the world should take him seriously. So this is a kind of response, okay? And you sort of feel that, well, there is worry, there is sort of like fear, about, well, how come, the Chinese leader would use such a threatening, term there, there to fight, the fights there actually connote something like violence, or the use of warfare, something like that, right? And this is from Reuters. So from something similar, okay? So the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right? So talks about dare to fight, and of course repeating what President Xi Jinping actually has talked about. And this is actually from the Western media. You see immediately people actually think about the, for example, the wolf warrior diplomacy, and then so this is something belligerent, right? So this is actually quite common to be observed. And so that's why we actually think that, well, dare to fight probably, till now, if the commentators, I mean, the media and some of the scholars, they have already used this term in that way, then perhaps, the other term would actually be a more neutral, a better term to be used, dare to struggle. And in any case, struggle, it doesn't necessarily mean, violence, warfare or fighting. Struggle can actually be something, you make an effort, right? You make an effort to survive, to grow, okay? And it is actually very common. I guess this is not just something you can find in China, but in all nations in the world. All nations have to struggle to survive. But it doesn't mean that they all have to be at war with each other, So so it's actually I mean the meaning can actually be something like broader and different when you compare to fights there. So this is, I mean, the third point here is just a quotation from Ho and Bu Xiaoyu, and I think this is quite useful. So dare to struggle better reflects the ideological, political, and multidimensional nature of the concept in Chinese official discourse. Precisely, the term 斗争 has a long and complex history within the PRC, and translating it as struggle better speaks to this nuance. In contrast, rendering the phrase as dare to fight risks, leaving English-speaking readers with a potentially inaccurate impression of its connotations. So, so the use of the later, of course, is to avoid the, I mean, further misunderstanding. Okay? Of China being, I mean, necessarily being materialistic and belligerent. And my observation, my observation of the current publications in the English-speaking world on the term "dare to struggle" is that, well, for most of them, they can actually be seen as a kind of crisis management, I call it, okay, in the international relations by the West. So it's a response, okay. So it's a response. So the feeling would be, I mean, the attitude would actually be like, well, now actually China is using such a term, and it looks like it's getting really more aggressive. So what can we do? Okay, so it's always this kind of concern. Okay, what can we do? What can we do to respond to, China's rise or the threats? The challenge to the West, especially, of course, the U.S. leadership, or more in general, the rules-based international order or liberal international order. So it looks like the use of the term "dare to struggle," 敢于斗争, has already become something like, of course, negative. Okay, and that's actually a symbol. Already has become a symbol, symbolizing that China is actually posing more threat to the West as well as to the rest of the world. So what can we do, right? So say, for example, this book. To my best knowledge, this book is actually the only monograph now we have in the market solely on the discussion about the term "dare to struggle" and in relation to China's global ambitions. And this was actually written by Professor Bei Skill, teaching in Australia. And you actually see that he actually he's actually focusing on 6 areas. So sovereignty, wealth, power, leadership, ideas, okay, and like, yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and also legitimacy. Okay, so 6 areas there. And in fact, the book does not really tell us much about the very meaning of the term "dare to struggle," but that China is actually a rising competitor, rival, and potentially a threat to the world. And in all these different areas, of course, he's actually arguing that, well, China is actually doing something, expanding. Say, for example, its influence, and then using more coercive measure towards not just the West, but also the developing countries, in its economic policies, in its sovereignty claims, etc., like these things. So I think there is always another perspective for us to look at all these different areas. So, okay, you can actually argue that, well, China is actually getting more assertive, more active, in these areas. But I guess on the other hand, you can also argue that, well, this may not be necessarily like threats posed by China, because any country can actually have righteous claims in all these areas, it's actually the rights to develop. So what is seen by, say, for example, some of the Western commentators or scholars as a threat would actually be something just not at all a threat, from the Chinese eyes, say, for example, right? So, so this is actually something like an example you can see in a publication in the English-speaking world these days. How scholars, they would actually connect the idea there to struggle with usually just these few keywords. Okay, so it must be about presidency. Okay, and it must be about him as, being an authoritarian leader, or well, say in President Biden's words, that would be a dictator. Okay, and the party states. Okay, so the CPC, and it has to do with China-US relations. Okay, it's always relating to that, and the struggle, the competition for global leadership, and the process of authoritarianization, okay, being led by China in the world these days. And of course, on the other hand, people are talking about Western democracy is actually in crisis. Okay, so back to the original question. So what can we do? This kind of response. So so I think this is actually just publications like that, just cherry picking the meaning of the term dare to struggle, and the scholars, they have just put a strict jacket to China's use of that term, and this may actually just tell us something about a feeling of xenophobia there. So this is actually from the book, okay, as you can see. So okay. So increasingly powerful, prosperous, and authoritarian China under the leadership of Xi Jinping has become a more intense competitor across the globe. Okay, and then the fundamental motivations driving the country's more dynamic, assertive, and risk-taking approach to the world under Xi Jinping. So this is also the concern of the author. Okay, and it's not just the author would actually ask such a questions. When you actually read some of the other scholars' writings, including some of the book reviews, written by other scholars on this book. Say, for example, Professor Rosemary Foote, a very famous Chinese politics expert at Oxford University. She also asked the question, so what is it that motivates China's international pursuits? When she comments on this book, okay? So she's also asking such a question. And it looks like, the focus of many scholars are actually really on the external relations of China, okay? So what China is actually doing outside, okay, of its country. And the six so-called important interests, okay? So the six areas we just talked about, so has been, they actually have been portrayed as outward-looking, proactive, something related to China's global desire and ambitions, okay, as well as areas which domestic oppression and crisis are found. Okay, usually this is actually what you can find in the mainstream writings there. Okay, and of course, it's also related to how China is shaping a more contested, in a way, more competitive international environment in the Indo-Pacific and also beyond as well. And my comments on all these writings would be, well, just like what I have said, is it really that important to ask the question? Always the same question, like, so uh, what is China doing, outside? What's the drive, the motive behind all these, more aggressive or more proactive gestures there? How can we actually respond to these kind of new behavior, right? My comment would actually be, well, it's not just China, like all sovereign states in the world, they all have the rights and the ability to also try to, develop themselves and to grow, and to make some international pursuits. So, I mean, if you just look at this thing, there is actually nothing wrong with it. But then, of course, the most important thing there is, are you actually posing some harm, say, for example, right, to other countries? And so this is one thing. And I mean, also think about, so till now, of course, the Cold War actually has passed for more than 30 years, right? But there could still be some sort of remains, in mentality, in the Western world that, well, that's actually from part of the previous memories I mean, the West have with the Soviet Union, because they don't like the communist country like that, and it's a dictatorship and is not a capitalist country, okay, and it actually works against the Western model, etc. Something like that is unfree, of course, right? It's illiberal and undemocratic. And China nowadays, has become the leader, in that small group of remaining countries. And when China actually asserts, with such a slogan called "Dare to Struggle," then maybe some of the people in the West would actually, I mean, this kind of slogan would trigger with their feeling that, well, we know China is actually just something like the Soviet Union in the past, right? And the word communist, I don't know why, but from time to time nowadays, in the 21st century, it's still being used to describe China. But China is actually in no case a communist country anyway. And even according to Marx theory, China is never a communist country. So, but this is actually, a term people would use, especially the Americans, they would use, to describe an illiberal and undemocratic country there. So, there is actually such a feeling. And on China's side, the Soviet Union also matters because, at least for the CPC, the party states, there is, of course, some kind of fear inside them. They don't want the country to follow the path of the Soviet Union because, it actually collapsed, in 1991. And you actually see especially say soon after that, Russia actually experienced, say, almost a decade of, the problem in development until, like, say, for example, President Putin actually came to power and then the whole situation actually gradually changed. China actually doesn't want something like that, of course. And so when China actually has such a worry inside it, then of course it knows the importance of keeping struggle. Why do you need to keep struggle? Because you have to survive. You have to survive. That's why you need to struggle. To struggle doesn't necessarily mean that you have to, beat another country, or to occupy territory from another country. The basic understanding of struggle, I mean, from a very Chinese perspective, is that you just have to survive and develop and to grow. you know. So so it's not something like you want to pose a threat to another country, neighboring country, the Philippines or Japan, or to even a leading country in the world like the US. And that's the Chinese government always say as well. We are not there to compete with the US. We just want our own space there to develop. Come on. And when we are talking about struggle, the I'm not sure what you guys would think, but then say from my perspective, being Chinese living here in Hong Kong is such a special place in China. My feeling is that, the first thing, when we are talking about struggle um, of our nation, the first thing is about, are we actually doing our job? And such a feeling or mentality, this can actually be very much traditional in our culture, rather than communist or Marxist. Of course, to many people, when they hear, the word struggle, they will actually think about, well, class struggle. Is it something about Marx, Lenin, and Mao, something like that. But from a very Chinese perspective, I guess. If you are not only talking about the nation, say if you are talking about the individual, right? Like I myself, I have to struggle as well, because I have to study, I have to work, I have to earn a living, and I have to grow as well. And this can be very confusing. From confusion, ideas, what we mean by, we actually talk about that very soon, today as well. The idea of being a 君子, so. An ideal, learned, educated man, of course, it has to do with struggle. Okay, you have to struggle with yourself. Of course, everybody actually has some defects, some problems, and the environment, of course, sometimes can be hostile as well. So you have to struggle in order to survive. This is the first thing, rather than to, like to be very ambitious or to be very aggressive towards your neighbor. So this would actually be my understanding. And so my observation of the mainstream writing on, commenting on Dare to Struggle this term, what I can find is that they're focusing on the external thing. So if I quote from the original words that, for example, Rosemary Foote, she actually uses, then she would actually talk about, well, international objective, the external conditions, the struggle to achieve what it wants. That means what China wants in world politics, okay? It's always outside, when she talks about Dare to Struggle. And so this is actually something what I can observe. But my understanding of the term is that, okay, you may actually have an external part, no problem. Okay, you can always understand the term from that perspective. But there is also an internal perspective. So it's more introspective, idealistic, and self-discipline. And that's actually, I just talked about minutes ago, it can be actually from classical Chinese understanding of the idea of struggle, or to strive for excellence, right? To survive, is actually related to that. So when we come to this question, many, I guess many political scientists, in the research of China, they ask this question. So what China wants? What does China want? This is always a question to be asked, right? And often we actually ask this question from the outside perspective. What does China want from the US? What does China want from the developing countries, from Africa? What does China want from us, right? Does China want us to, also, adopt the Chinese development model, or to join the Belt and Road Initiative, or become an authoritarian regime, something like that, right? So, so many people will actually ask questions like that, but then they actually neglected what actually China wants from the inside. Okay, so it's actually the demand China actually has for itself. So this is something to the core of my study here. When we look at nowadays party states of China, okay, so from this perspective of looking at the idea of Dare to Struggle, there is, of course, something which can echo with the mainstream storytelling of the West. We just talked about that, right? So it has to do with the external environment. But still, there is actually some difference there, because from China's perspective, it will actually say that, well, Dare to Struggle, of course, we have to struggle because we are getting blocked and isolated by the US. We are not talking about we are being aggressive or dominating, but we are talking about, our rights of development is actually being restricted, okay, mainly by, the current leading power, the United States. So, and also our domestic affairs, including issues. Of course, we have heard a lot about them, the development of high technology, something related to separatism in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, and also, other very politically sensitive areas like, say, like human rights and freedom, and of course, China would regard all these are actually within its own domestic area, and nowadays, of course, very easily, they would actually use the term national security to cover, all these areas. And to say that, well, it's because the US and also some other countries, they are always interfering with these areas, domestic areas, then that's why we have to struggle, okay? Because the international environment is hostile. So it's actually the official, okay, the official description. And I have a quotation from President Xi. This is actually exactly the words from him. Okay, so Western countries led by the US have implemented all around containment, encirclement, and suppression of China, which has brought unprecedented severe challenges to our country's development. So there is a need for the Chinese nation and the people to struggle. And I guess a lot of you will still remember 2 years ago in March in Alaska, this meeting. So there was still during COVID. Some of the officials, you can't see their faces very clearly because with the masks, but then you can still feel the tension, of course. And so basically, the two sides, they were just bombarding each other, and China actually put it very straightforward, very clearly that, well, don't ever try to lecture us, on areas that we actually take it very seriously. So, so that was actually, I guess, till nowadays, still the almost like the peak, of the tension between the two countries when China really felt that, the need to struggle, to dare to struggle with the hostile international environments there, right? And so from the news, of course, we can also see these things, right? So the top one is actually from the New York Times, and the one below is actually from should be from the Independence, okay, so, a newspaper in the UK. So basically talking about the same thing. And it's open, of course. The Chinese government is being open about that. The Western media is also being open, reporting these things. We are not sure if such a situation has changed now, because several weeks ago, President Xi actually went to the US, as we know, and met President Biden, and seemingly, suddenly you have, I mean, the whole atmosphere has changed a little bit, right? So they actually became quite friendly with each other. But of course, we know there are many factors behind, probably also including what's going on nowadays in Gaza, the very unexpected war between Israel and Hamas there. So the foreign policy strategy of the US as well as China may have changed because of that as well. So, but in any case, hopefully the situation is getting better. I mean, the relationship between China and the US. But my observation about, China's talking about dare to struggle would be based on, the period before the alleviation of the tension just several weeks ago. I'm sorry about this, but I just lack of the time to do the whole translation, so I will translate it for you guys. So it's I know it's a lot, but I personally find these two paragraphs actually very accurately tells us something about the official thought, okay, the official perspective on the idea of a struggle, okay. So it actually, just a second, talks about that, well, President Xi actually believes that, the 5 years from the 19th Party Congress, that means from 2017 to 2022, okay, these 5 years were actually very unusual 5 years because the external environment the international environment has changed a lot, and there has been a lot of very unpredictable factors and incidents actually happened. And the West, led by the US, actually made a lot of the suppression and blockade, and they actually made a lot of like the obstacles for us, and that's why when we are talking about China's development, we are actually experiencing something very difficult. Plus the fact that because of COVID, because of the economic deterioration, okay, we are actually facing a lot of difficulties, but then we are still tough, and we are actually not superstitious, okay, and we don't fear oppression, okay, we are not fear of afraid of difficulties as well. So we still have a lot of very magnificent goals, in terms of economic developments, and also the goal to national rejuvenation, okay, under our plan of socialist modernization of the country. And this is actually a result of, now we have the word struggle, okay, this is actually a result of struggle by the people of the whole country. And then the rest would actually be, I mean, the main point there would be, well, the people in China should actually have solidarity, okay, should get together and to dare. Now you actually have the term here, dare to struggle, okay, dare to struggle. And that actually means to face all these difficulties, okay, with prudence, okay, with patience, and with a kind of very mature and stable attitude, okay, and to do something to do something proactively when the opportunity comes, okay. So and basically it's about that, okay. So it's actually the party states actually calling for support, okay, from the people, and telling people that, well, we have to get together, and now dare to struggle actually means we have a lot of difficulties and challenges to face in terms of our development. So in order to meet all those goals, we actually have to strive for the excellence. And from many of the official publications, say for example this one from the People's Daily, okay, this is from the People's Daily, connected to the party's news department, I think. So it's actually about, well, the spirit of dare to struggle and able to struggle is actually something at the core of the spirit of the 20th Party Congress in 2022. And this is, of course, the latest, right? The latest Party Congress we have in China, and very important. And then this one talks about, well, dare to struggle is actually the core spirit of the Xi Jinping spirit of socialism with Chinese characteristics, okay, in the new era. So this also tells you something about the very important status of the slogan there. So you will actually see that from the Chinese, I mean, the current, today's party state's perspective, it looks like the term dare to struggle is actually something that more related to a kind of psychological attitude or a kind of philosophy, it's ideational slogan calling for the support by the people, okay, and also among the party members as well. So and when people talk about 斗争, struggle, this is actually the original Chinese word 斗争. It actually refers to some of the qualities, not just the nation or the party states can have, but also individuals they can also have. All citizens, they also can have this kind of qualities. For example, resilience, endurance, tenacity, fortitude, etc. Like all these things. And particularly, I mean, in particular, very importantly, in the face of adversity, when when the nation is actually facing difficulty, then, you need to really, live out these spirits, and also the qualities there. So, so it's actually more abstract, it's actually more abstract um, discussion there. And usually the party states would relate the term 斗争 to some even more, lofty, very lofty goals. Say, for example, the Chinese dream or the China dream, and then the national rejuvenation of the country, and a loss of the great projects, etc. These things, right? And even for the term called 军事斗争, okay, military struggle, right? We call it military struggle, 军事斗争. There are also some scholars arguing that, well, we can't actually just take the literal meaning and understand that, well, when China talks about 军事斗争, it actually means that, well, next month, then they're actually going to send their troops to Taiwan or, or to the South China Sea. It's actually not like that, okay? It's actually just a kind of expression, okay, to express that the military has to overcome obstacles, say, for example, in their mentality, their thinking, and in their preparation for the future unexpected situations. Okay. So, and there has been no evidence to show how the party states and the leader of the country actually encourage violence conflicts there. Okay. And in reality, I think what we can observe is actually something, at least till now, okay, at least till now, it's actually quite the opposite. You look at what China has been saying, or doing in regard of, the war in Ukraine, for example, or what's going on nowadays in Gaza, so China has been trying its best to be the moderator, to say that, well, there must be some more peaceful means, to solve the problems, and you guys should not actually fight, and you guys should actually go back to the original negotiation table or something like that, right? So at least that's something we can see these days till now. So yeah, and then so from nowadays party states behavior, we can actually see that probably even if we agree that the Chinese party states can be more aggressive in the external environment, okay, in its foreign policy, then we cannot deny that there is another dimension, okay, there is always another aspect. When China is actually talking about dare to struggle, it's actually related to how it faces its own problems. And some scholars, I mean, including Professor Todd and Professor Pu Xiaoyu, they also argue that, well, the use of the term actually tells us something about, it's not about an aggressive China, but that China is actually very worried. It's a sense of pessimism, a sense of pessimism and crisis within the, say, for example, maybe within the members of the standing committee of the Politburo, because they actually can see a lot of problems there within the country, as well as in the international environment of China. So it's because of their worry, because they are actually quite pessimistic about the future of the country, then they actually stress the need to struggle there, So, and this reading would actually be quite different, compared to the mainstream reading of the English-speaking academic world, as I have just told you guys, something about an aggressive and religion in China. And talking about how the party states can focus on itself, if it's actually really worrying about the situation in the nation, and also in the international environment, then what does it mean to struggle, to struggle? Then I think the concept of self-revolution is actually one example, So the focus on self-strengthening to self-improve, self-discipline, self-perfection. And this has a lot to do, of course, with the crackdown on corruption by the party state. And as we know, this is especially true after President Xi has came to power. Okay, and of course, many people can criticize on that as well, because people can also say that this is actually a gesture for the party to actually get rid of the people who disagree. Okay, in China, I mean, in terms of politics and society, probably true, but then there is also another dimension to look at it. It's actually a gesture to sustain the rule of the party there. Because of course, corruption I guess for any country in the world is the same. Corruption is actually one of the most dangerous thing, the factor for the collapse of the government or regime. So and for the Chinese party states, of course, it's actually they actually know it very well. And I think sometimes I would actually think that if we want to also fit this into another very famous concept, I guess most of us know that, authoritarian resilience. That's a term coined by the Columbia University professor Andrew Nathan, right, many years ago, more than 20 years ago already. Authoritarian resilience. This is actually part of the reason, why China actually has something called authoritarian resilience, because it can adapt to different environments and changing environments. And this also has to do with a sense of fear, the fear for not being to survive, say, for example, in the coming 15 or 20 years. And then if the party is to collapse, then what will happen to the nation? Okay, something like that. So you would actually be focusing on itself, okay? And when you look at this one and compare to earlier, I talked a little bit about the traditional Chinese culture, right? The more Confucian way of looking at struggle, then there could be some sort of relation, some connection there. How come a party or a government should actually always self improve and to look at itself, and to be strict about itself, right? So of course, this is open for debate, but I just personally find maybe there is actually sort of a connection. So we've actually talked something about what has happened, in the past few years, especially after President Xi came to power, and what we can observe in the Western media and academia, as well as from the Chinese party state's perspective on such a slogan. And next, I would just like to suggest some observations there. Okay, some observations. So my question there would be, okay, so we know that 敢于斗争, okay, dare to struggle. This is something we can see in nowadays Chinese politics. And we can actually say that maybe it's because Xi Jinping actually invented that term, or at least he actually is actually the person who initiated the use of that term in the past few years. Okay, but what I mean, where did the party states of China, or where did President Xi actually get this term from, get this idea from? There must be some sources in the past, right? And of course, I guess for many people who have just some basic understanding about Chinese modern history and also Chinese politics, they may actually already have an answer. It has to do with Mao. Mao is actually the person who really talks a lot about Douzheng, the term called struggle. And I guess now I haven't actually really done the statistics, but I can do that later. Okay, can actually see that whether Mao actually used this term more than Xi, or is it the other way around? But personally, I actually have a guess that Mao is actually still the leader who used to use the term for the largest number of times. Okay, so The term actually, I mean, the term struggle, they actually mean, I mean, Douzheng actually means a loss to the CPC in its history of development. And it has to do with the modern Chinese history. So we are actually talking about, yes, officially it's called the century of humiliation. Okay, so the Western colonialism and imperialism, and the time when China needs to struggle for its own national independence. And the use of the concept of struggle was also there in the stories of the first cooperation between the Communist Party and the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, the first cooperation during the 1920s. And it's not just about slogan and propaganda. It's not just about political emotion, but it is about self-improvement and progress in the process of suffering alleviation and the strive for a nation's and the people's basic rights, dignity, and autonomy, especially during the early 20th century when China was so weak and so poor. Okay? So the use of the term struggle actually has to do with a story which you can find a revolution which is still going on these days, at least from the perspective of the CPC. And it builds the modern Chinese culture, and it builds the character of modern China there as well. So, so we actually see that nowadays use of the term struggle actually can be traced. I mean, the source can be traced all the way back to Mao. And of course, there are always people talking about Xi Jinping to a certain extent is just like another Mao. Okay, people have been talking about that for years as well. So maybe this is also something we can get some inspiration from. Anyway, people are talking about the lapse leaning, lapse wing politics. So this is actually the first thing. So I jump a little bit here. So for Mao, this is actually just a few selections from his sayings, and writings. So as you can see, he actually still has a lot. Okay, I actually just don't have the time to quote everything here today, but you actually see that, right? And this is actually very famous: to cast away illusions and prepare to struggle. 丢掉幻想，准备到斗争。And also, something about the logic of the people is actually about the basic logic and strategy about the people's movement. There is to struggle, and you can fail, but after you fail, you actually struggle again, and then repeat until you get a final victory, and etc. Okay, so it can actually be related to perseverance. It's an attitude. It can be related to armed forces. Okay, so what we call 武装. And also struggle can be understood as a kind of idea and value there. Okay, so it's the struggle in terms of thinking. And so here we may actually already understand, okay, so there could be a chance that, well, Xi actually gets his ideas from Mao, okay, when he's actually talking about 斗争, okay, struggle. But where did Mao actually get the idea of struggle from? There is actually another question, okay? So intellectually speaking, I mean, in terms of intellectual history in China, I personally find there is actually a relations in terms of thinking, okay, in terms of intellectual thinking between Mao and the modern Chinese writer Lu Xun. Lu Xun, as we know, of course, he's super famous, okay, in modern Chinese history, and he's a left-wing writer. He's actually not a member of the Chinese Communist Party, but then he has a very close relationship with many of the early members of the Chinese Communist Party. And when Lu Xun actually died, Mao was actually still young. Okay, Lu Xun was actually an elderly, So and And it was actually quite clear in history. We know that the young Mao, okay, when Mao Zedong was actually young, he actually read a lot of Lu Xun's writings. So whether Mao actually, I mean, his mind was actually shaped by Lu Xun, that's actually something we can dig out, okay, to see if there is any connection between the two. But in any case, Lu Xun actually still has a very high reputation in China these days, of course. I mean, officially, I mean, within the party states, as well as among the common people, okay, because of his style of writing, okay, because of his spirit of being a very strong and, I mean, a strong man being, having the spine, right? Being regarded as the spiritual pillar of the nation. And he's very daring in criticizing um, the political conservatives and then the aggressors, etc. Right. So so till today, he's actually still very influential. So two ways, two paths of influence there. One is actually his influence on Mao, and all the way down to the influence on other leaders in the CPC, including Xi Jinping. And the other path is actually just Lu Xun's influence on the Chinese public, is the people. So how he actually has shaped the nation's spirit, and how such spirit has to do with struggle, the idea of Douzheng there. So this person definitely, I think, is actually important, and I'll actually spend more time on him, on his writings later, when I keep working on my project. And from that perspective, I mean, if we look at the early 20th century, so the early time of the Chinese Communist Party and the left-wing scholars and writers, you actually see that struggle is actually, I mean, Douzheng, okay, or I should say Douzheng, was actually a very commonly applied, okay, discussed term among the politicians, the movement leaders, writers, scholars, and of course, mainly is because China was actually in a very dire situation at that time, because it was weak and poor, and and it actually has just so many problems to be solved, right? And the country was split as well. So that's why there was actually a need to struggle, okay, to Douzheng. And if we understand that there is such an origin of the understanding of the term, then maybe nowadays when we look at how we actually interpret dare to struggle this term, then we actually may have some more understanding. This is actually from history. So
Walter,
yep.
Excuse me, just a short interruption. Could I ask you to maybe finish within the next 5 minutes so that we can have
sure.
like 20 minutes for the discussion? Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So so you actually see that the early 20th century was actually a time where we actually see that many intellectuals, it's not just politicians, many intellectuals also discussed the idea of struggle. And Mao was actually young at that time as well. And this poem was, I mean, it has been, I guess, it's actually quite famous. And people, I mean, for both people who like or dislike Mao, they can actually quote from this poem. When Mao wrote this poem, he was only 24 years old. And he was actually talking about the pleasure of struggle, okay? This is actually a kind of reflection upon the reading of a philosophical book on ethics, okay? So it was actually told that, this was the moment after Mao read something related to, a description that, in our world, when there is a rebellion or revolt, then there must be another force, fighting back. And then it's almost like kind of, it's a philosophical, but also something related to, I mean, maybe physics, this kind of relationship. And the young Mao actually just enjoyed this kind of, the feeling, because he was young as well as a young man, of having the drive, the energy to strive for excellence and to, of course, try to find a way to save his nation as well. And very interestingly, in the Chinese language, if you don't want to use the word the term called 斗争, there is another term called 奋斗. So it's actually very similar. And you actually find that it's not just Mao, but also Sun Yat-sen, as well as even Chiang Kai-shek. They actually have some sayings and also calligraphy, as here you can see, that's related to the concept of 奋斗. Well, if you want to translate the term 奋斗 into English, that can also mean struggle. It's also struggle. Okay. And very famously, I mean, for Sun Yat-sen, of course, we know the founding father of the Republic of China, right? So it's actually from his last words to his comrades, as well as to the Soviet Union government. He's actually talking about, well, we've actually done our best to strive for a better life for our people and for the nation, but because I'm actually dying, so it's very important for you guys to just keep struggling, okay, keep working, towards our goal. And he's actually referring to a spirit of struggle as well, 共同奋斗. So we actually struggle together, for the future nation and for the well-being of our people there. So it was actually in 1925. He's actually talking about it. And for Chinese, traditional Chinese culture, there must be something we can get from, which is related to the idea of struggle. And it has so much to do with the idea of self-strengthening, self-improvement, self-discipline, something like this. And it is not only a discussion on virtue ethics, but also is about the traditional Chinese worldview and cosmology. Okay, so the major idea is that, well, to develop yourself, to thrive, to grow, it doesn't mean that you have to be bad to others. Okay. So the focus will only be just on yourself, and challenge is actually good for you. No difficulty, if there is no difficulty, then there will be no progress. Okay, so when you look at the nature, the mother nature, when you look at different seasons, right? When you look at the whole universe, you actually see that, well, there is a force which is always struggling. Okay, and when we apply that to our understanding of a nation or even the individual human beings, it's actually the same. We all have to survive and to grow. So we have to just keep moving, working, and struggling. And this is actually basically what it means. So the universe, right? I always find very fascinating, when I say like reading the Book of Changes, like 周易 or 易经. And when you look at a photo like that, talking about the universe, seemingly the idea is actually there. So very famous this quotation, right? 天行健, 君子以自强不息. So well, the heaven, the universe, actually runs in its own drive and strength. It only supports those people who would actually also practice the same. Okay, practice the same force there. You have to work, you have to keep going, right? And there are also some other quotations, okay, also talking about the same thing. Okay, you have to go, you have to keep just going, just like, for example, the third one here, flowing water does not rot, right? So you just keep going, and then that's how you can actually survive and develop, right? So and because of the limitation of time, I just finished the rest. And the classical dimension here, I think many people would say that, well, seemingly it is irrelevant to our discussion of dare to struggle, but then I think it would be important. Although till now, we may still not have a direct proof, okay, to see the connection between nowadays use of dare to struggle with those classics. But then, China is actually not just a sovereign state or a nation state, but it's a civilization too. The political tradition, the philosophical tradition is always there. This is something which is invisible, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact on the political development, till nowadays. So, so I would actually say that this is still important, earlier we talked about the problem of translation in a term, okay, and that's part of the reason why many people have misunderstood the term called 斗争. So the use of classical understanding here, the classical conceptions, there is actually a good thing also, because by using the classical conceptions directly, then we can actually, sort of avoid the chance of having the term being misread or misunderstood. And the last part here would be just I think many of you may just think that this is impossible, but I actually have some feeling actually, and I would really like to find something like a connection. We of course know Marx and Engels, right? In their writings, they talk about class struggle, and China till now is actually ruled by a communist party. And what they talk about struggle can still be largely related to Marx and Engels' idea of class struggle. This is very commonly understood. But for Nietzsche and even Beethoven, because for these two, now, I'm of course not in the position of talking about these two. I guess you guys would actually be really experts. Both of them, all these people, they're German speaking anyway. Yeah. So, but my understanding would be in their thinking or even in their life experience, is a lot about struggle as well. And I'm actually thinking about how the idea of Nietzsche and also the music and the story of Beethoven, they were actually introduced to China in the early 20th century. There was a story. And you actually see that it was actually the left wing, those intellectuals who are actually close to the early, version of the Chinese Communist Party, they actually discuss a lot about Nietzsche and Beethoven. And those people, they actually include Lu Xun, like the writer we just talked about. So would that actually be also, let me go here first, okay? Actually also be a kind of inference there, So sorry for my handwriting, okay, not very good. You actually have C here, okay, so this is actually where we began. So dare to struggle. And I just talked about maybe it's actually from Mao, okay, because Mao actually talks even more about dare to struggle. And when we ask the question, so where did Mao get this idea from? That may actually be, of course, from when he was young. Okay, he actually read Lu Xun, and of course Mao also read Marx and Lenin. Okay, this is very understandable. And also we have to see how Mao was actually influenced by classical Chinese thought, right? And for Lu Xun here, obviously he has a connection, okay? His understanding of Nietzsche and Beethoven would be very interesting. And how this actually has shaped Lu Xun's thought, and in return, actually would shape Mao's understanding of what a struggle should be. Okay, so that would actually be something I would like to understand. And so it's actually from the top, from the surface, okay? We actually dig the hole all the way down. It's just like, drilling down the soil all the way down, right? So we'll actually see whether they have some sort of relationship. And lastly, I would like to just point out that, well, maybe we don't need to be too nervous or, too anxious about, say China just keep using this kind of term called dare to struggle. Because as we know, as I have talked about, all nations have to struggle, and we all struggle anyway. And this is actually not just really something exclusive, for China. And when I talk about, even for Nietzsche and Beethoven, I can also think about, all the way you can trace it back to, for example, the origin of Western civilization. You actually have this mythology, Sisyphus, right? So the idea of rolling the stone all the way up to the hill, and then, unfortunately, you have to do the whole thing again repeatedly. This is also a struggle. And this is a very humanistic understanding of the human condition, and in the West. And when you apply that to China, in modern Chinese history, it can be applicable as well. So can there be some sort of similarity or something that we can make into a dialogue, in our understanding of struggle? on top of all those things we know from the Cold War mentality, okay, there should be some more additional understanding, right? So this is something I would like to also do in the coming time, okay, for this project. So thank you very much. I guess I just better stop here. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you for this wonderful and very interesting